The outback doesn't speak in word, it hums and sighs. It rustles through spinifex grass and howls between ranges scorched by time. But sometimes, when the sun drops low and the shadows stretch long, it whispers something older. Not in English, not in anything you'd call language. It's a memory, perhaps. A warning. Or maybe just the land remembering what it swallowed. Karratha. A place on the edge of the known, pressed up against red desert like a scar that never fully healed. In the dry season of 1987, a family of 4 stepped onto the trail that snakes behind the ranges there. A path used by miners, dreamers, the occasional drifter. A trail red as dried blood. David and Sarah Gibson, and their 2 young children, Emily and Tom, left behind their Holden sedan with a note tucked behind the windscreen. Back by nightfall. They weren't. The desert doesn't rush. Neither at first did concern. Maybe they camped overnight. Maybe the kids got tired and they took a detour. But come morning, the car was still there. Dust collecting, heat building. And suddenly the question wasn't if they'd return, but why they hadn't. Search crews arrived by midday. Rangers, locals, police flown in from Roebourne. Helicopters chopped the heat-heavy air. Men on horses and dogs trained to pick up scent spread out into the scrub. They found boot prints, faded, barely there, leading into the first rise. And then nothing. Only the heat remained, the shimmer off the stones. The relentless buzz of cicadas. 3 days into the search, someone spotted it. A small cloth doll, arms outstretched, faded blue dress barely holding its color against the dust. It lay by a junction in the trail where the signage had long been worn down by the sun, 2 kilometers from the car park. It looked placed, not dropped, not flung, like it was waiting, like it knew. People talked. They always do. A tracker named Ronnie Jardine said he felt something strange in that air, a heaviness, like walking through syrup. He wouldn't go past that fork. "Place don't want you," he muttered. Then he packed his gear and drove out. Never came back. That week, the papers ran front-page stories. Family vanishes on Crimson Trail. TV crews set up near the trailhead. Locals avoided the place. Some whispered of cursed lands. Others blamed the heat. But no one, not even the experts with maps and tech, could explain how 4 people could simply vanish. No signs of struggle, no blood, no gear. Just that doll and the silence. There's something ancient in that part of the Pilbara. Something that doesn't care for our explanations. Rocks older than memory. Caves no one's charted. Shadows that move a little different when you're not looking. In time, the search wound down. The choppers stopped circling. The press left. The trail reopened. But no one walked it quite the same again. And the Gibsons? They became a story. A cautionary tale told in quiet tones at the Karratha pub when the wind picks up and the sky turns the color of rust. A family that walked into the bush and were never seen again. Before the silence settled, there was noise, movement, urgency, the sound of boots on gravel and radios crackling in clipped bursts. The search parties pressed further inland, clinging to the hope that the Gibsons had simply veered off the main track. A wrong turn, a twisted ankle, anything that made sense. But the land out there, it doesn't follow logic. It folds in on itself, plays tricks with distance and direction. Even seasoned trackers confessed the terrain felt wrong, as if it was reshaping behind them, covering its tracks. They combed the scrub, picked through gullies, prodded at dried creek beds and shaded overhangs where snakes and shadows alike slept thick. Volunteers marked their paths with orange tape, but by the next morning, some strips had vanished, as if the wind had eaten them, or something else had. 3 weeks in, the official search was scaled back. There were no new clues, no bodies, no sign of struggle, not even dropped food wrappers or footprints beyond that first rise. The press moved on. Interest cooled. But not for everyone. Frank McGregor, then a senior detective from Perth, stayed on. Something about the case clung to him. He'd seen accidents, disappearances, even homicides, but never this. "You don't just lose a family," he told a local reporter years later. "Not without the land giving something back." He pored over maps, flight logs, temperature records, interviewed every bushwalker who'd used the trail that week. None had seen anything after the Gibsons set off. One man, A Dutch backpacker named Eric recalled passing them briefly that morning. Said the kids were laughing. Sarah waved. David nodded. Nothing odd, except… Eric hesitated. There was someone else, he said. I think. But when pressed, he couldn't explain. Just a feeling. Like they weren't alone. That detail stuck with McGregor. He requested aerial surveys of the region, looking for unusual markings or hidden shelters. One image, taken weeks later, showed faint depressions near a cluster of rocks 20 kilometers off the known path. But by then, wind and time had erased any definition. It could have been anything, or nothing. And always, there was the doll. It stayed with McGregor long after the case cooled. He had it tested. Fibers, prints, anything forensic could scrape out. But it yielded no answers. Clean. Untouched. Save for the dust. It now sits in a glass box at the Karratha Historical Society, a quiet exhibit few look at for long. Something about it makes people uneasy. Not afraid exactly. Just unsettled. As if it's watching. As if it remembers. Locals began avoiding the trail altogether. Stories crept in, slow and steady, like rising heat. Campers who claimed to hear footsteps around their tents at night. Low voices calling names that weren't theirs. A woman, hiking alone, swore she saw a figure ahead of her on the path. A child in blue, who vanished when she blinked. She ran the rest of the way, didn't stop until she hit the ranger's hut. I don't care if it was a hallucination, she told them. That place doesn't want people. Still, some were drawn in. The curious. The obsessed. Amateur sleuths who'd read about the case online and wanted to solve it. They came with cameras and gear, trying to retrace the Gibson steps. Most left disillusioned. A few left disturbed. One man, Nathan Crowley, claimed he found carvings in a rock wall deep in an uncharted gully. Symbols, almost runic, worn down by time. He posted grainy photos online. Said he was going back with a team. He never did. Stopped responding to messages. Deleted his accounts. Moved east. When asked why by a friend, he simply said, they weren't carvings. Whatever he meant. No one's ever found those markings again. And through it all, the trail remained, baked under the same unrelenting sun, breathing its slow, crimson breath. The years didn't erase the story. They just pushed it deeper. Beneath bar chatter, behind locked drawers in the local cop shop, under layers of dust in archives where names blur and time forgets. But some stories refuse to go quiet. They linger, like the scent of rain on ironstone. Like footsteps that echo when no one else is near. By 1995, McGregor had long since retired. Still, the case stayed with him. He'd return to Karratha every couple of years, walk the first stretch of the trail alone. Not to find something, he said, but to remember what wasn't there. It's the absence that haunts, he wrote in a private letter to a former colleague. You look at the earth, and you feel it. What's missing? He wasn't alone in that. A handful of others, bushmen, rangers, even former volunteers from the original search, kept returning, drawn back like moths circling something unseen. Not hope. Not anymore. Something else. As if they were listening for an answer not yet spoken. Then came 2005. A mining survey crew, conducting seismic tests for a new extraction zone well beyond the mapped edges of the trail, reported an anomaly. A hollow, partially collapsed cavern obscured by thick scrub and ironbark. They weren't looking for anything unusual, just minerals. But what they found startled them. Inside, the remnants of a long-dead fire, a few rusted tins, and a set of metal utensils wrapped carefully in a strip of faded cloth. The utensils were odd, too well kept for the decay around them, and one fork bore a faint engraving. SG. The initials matched Sarah Gibson. It could have been coincidence. But coincidences in the Outback carry a different weight. Authorities were notified. The site sealed. Forensics descended, lifted the utensils, analyzed the fire remains. But the cave was dry, its soil alkaline and stubborn. No human traces confirmed. No dates narrowed. Just the eerie sense that someone had been there. Recently, or long ago. No one could say. The utensils were placed into evidence. Eventually, quietly, they vanished from records. Lost, they said, in a storage transfer between departments. No explanation, just another gap in the story. And gaps in this story are where the dark things grow. Following the cave discovery, more sightings emerged. Whispers, unverified, unprovable, but persistent. A ranger claimed to have seen figures moving against the skyline near twilight, too far to identify, but distinct. Another reported laughter echoing through the gorges late at night. Not animal, not wind, human, high-pitched, childlike. Skeptics chalked it up to imagination, to the land playing tricks. But the stories aligned too well, came too close, too often. A pattern started to form. And in the center of that pattern sat the trail, coiled and waiting. That same year, an Aboriginal elder from a community east of Millstream came forward, reluctantly, to speak to a small gathering at the Karratha Museum. His name was Jacob Ulara. He'd lived his life with one foot in each world, his people's, and the one that tried to pave over it. He didn't mention the Gibsons by name. He didn't have to. "There are places you don't go," he said. "Old places. Sacred. The land holds stories older than people. Some trails aren't for walking. Not all light is safe light." He pointed to a map, a crude hand-drawn thing, generations old, and there it was, a shaded crescent scrawled over the general area where the Gibson family had disappeared. The elder looked at the small audience, his eyes like granite. "You dig too deep," he said. "You wake things that were meant to sleep." The room was quiet after that. No one challenged him. No one laughed. For a while, after Jacob Ulara's quiet warning, a hush seemed to fall over Karratha. Not a silence of peace, but of weight. A pressure in the air that made people think twice before heading bush. Even the most practical among them, the ones who'd scoff at the notion of spirits or cursed trails, found reasons to avoid that stretch of country. The trail was still open, technically, maintained, barely. But it became a place no one advertised. Tourists weren't encouraged. Signage grew faded, then vanished altogether. Maps simply omitted it, as if the land itself had begun erasing the line the Gibsons once walked. Those who did go, drawn by obsession, or doubt, or something harder to name, found a landscape subtly changed. A bend that wasn't where it should be, a ridgeline unfamiliar, GPS readings that jittered and jumped, failing to sync with any known coordinates. One hiker, a man from Sydney documenting forgotten tracks for a niche blog, wrote that his compass spun slowly when held near the old junction where the doll had been found. He dismissed it in his post as magnetic interference, but ended his entry with a line that stuck out like a torn thread. "It felt like the trail was watching me." That same year, a local nurse named Elaine Bristow shared a dream she'd had with her sister, who then, perhaps foolishly, posted it to a community forum. The dream was vivid, more memory than fantasy. In it, Elaine saw two children, walking hand in hand through a grove of ghost gums. The boy kept looking back, anxious. The girl held something in her free hand, a doll with one eye missing. They were barefoot, silent, as if listening for something behind them. Elaine had never hiked the trail. She wasn't a superstitious woman, but she woke crying, she said, and the feeling lingered for days. "It wasn't a nightmare," she told her sister. "It was like I'd stumbled into someone else's grief." The post didn't stay up long. The forum admin, an old bloke with no patience for hysteria, took it down. But screenshots spread, and for those who already believed, or feared, it added another stitch to the ever-growing shroud of mystery. A few voices tried to push back. Scientists, rationalists, even McGregor, now in his 70s, gave a weary interview to a national podcast, trying to reframe the story in practical terms. "We didn't find them," he said, "because the bush doesn't care about our timelines. It doesn't hide things, it just keeps moving. Sand drifts, rain shifts the gullies. What was visible one day might vanish the next." But his voice faltered when asked about the doll, and he didn't mention the cave, or the utensils, and still, the trail waited. Then, in late 2008, during one of the driest seasons on record, a controlled burn meant to clear underbrush around the trail flared out of control. The fire crews managed to contain it before it reached any populated areas, But the heart of the trail, the middle stretch, the part no one walked anymore, was scorched black. Weeks later, when rangers returned to assess the damage, they found something unexpected. Char marks on the trees, sure. Split rocks, wildlife flushed and gone. But also, a circle. Perfect. Maybe 2 meters across. Unburned. As if the flames had skipped it. In the center, a pile of stones. Not natural. Placed. Deliberate. Inside the pile, a rusted children's shoe. It was small. Faded. Leather cracked from sun and time. Tests were inconclusive. Age couldn't be precisely determined. No DNA left. But one of the original searchers, a woman named Ruth Dawes, claimed she recognized it. She'd seen Emily Gibson wear a pair just like it. White laces, star-shaped eyelets, the same. Once again, the bush had returned a whisper. Just enough to deepen the silence. The shoe never made it to any official evidence room. Word has it, it was passed quietly to the regional authorities, logged in a file that would eventually be buried in a digital database nobody checks. Some say the shoe was lost during transfer. Others say it was taken deliberately, not out of malice but fear. As though documenting it would force someone to reckon with what it meant. There's a term locals sometimes use when speaking of that part of the country. Thin places. Borrowed, maybe, from old European beliefs, but it fits. Places where the line between what is and what was, between the seen and the unseen, is worn like riverstone. Smooth. Permeable. And the stretch of the Crimson Trail between the first ridge and that old dry gully is one of them. Even those who'd dismissed the older stories, Jacob Ulara's warning, the woman's dream, the man's compass spinning like a mad clock, began to admit something wasn't right. Too many sightings. Too many disappearances of things too small to notice alone. A boot print gone by morning. A path you're sure was there that now leads nowhere. In 2011, an independent filmmaker from Melbourne named Lyle Corrigan came through town. He was working on a documentary about unsolved Australian mysteries. Bush disappearances, mostly. And naturally, the Gibson case drew him in like a magnet. He was methodical, professional, but also driven in a way that unsettled some. Like he wasn't just documenting the story, but trying to insert himself into it. He interviewed old residents, camped near the trailhead, even attempted to retrace the Gibsons' likely route. What he returned with was strange. His footage, all time-stamped, geotagged, had gaps. Entire hours missing from his camera. Batteries drained inexplicably. His GPS froze at one point, stuck on coordinates that didn't exist. When plotted, the glitch formed a rough spiral. Lyle left town in a rush a week later. Never completed the documentary. No formal explanation. His production assistant told a friend, he was different after Karratha, like something followed him out. His website went down soon after. He never responded to emails or calls again. Then, a year later, his footage resurfaced. Uploaded anonymously to a fringe forum. Grainy, clipped, and scattered. In one frame, barely more than a few seconds, something moves at the edge of the frame, behind a rock, mid-afternoon. Too quick to identify, too upright for wildlife. The uploader claimed it was a child. Most dismissed it. But those who knew the land, who'd felt that weight in their chest walking near that trail, said it felt wrong. Not staged, not tricked, just wrong. And so the cycle continued. Every few years, a ripple, a new theory, a sighting, a whisper. One woman, a linguist working with local indigenous groups, claimed she'd come across a word in an old dialect, no direct English translation, that described places the land reclaims. Places not meant to be trespassed. The word, roughly, meant where footsteps vanish. Not because they're erased, but because they are taken. She didn't elaborate. Didn't have to. The phrase spread like dust through the cracks of Karratha's collective memory, seeping into pub talk, old radio calls, late-night stories around campfires, where footsteps vanish. By now, the trail existed more as myth than path. Fewer walked it. Fewer still spoke of it without a glance over the shoulder, a pause, a measured tone. It wasn't taboo, not quite. The Outback doesn't do superstition the way the cities do, but it had become sacred in its own strange way. marked not by shrines or fences, but by silence, a quiet respect, the kind given to graves with no names. In 2015, a station hand named Rowan Forrester, used to long hauls between cattle posts, veered off course on his motorbike chasing a stray. The terrain pulled him farther east than he'd meant to go, across scrub he didn't recognize, until his bike coughed and died beneath him. He tried for hours to fix it, gave up, set camp near a dry creek bed, and waited for daylight. That night he didn't sleep. The stars were out, full, blistering sky, the kind that feels too close. And the wind never stopped. It whispered, tugged, pulled. Around midnight, he heard something move near his camp. Not cattle, not wind. He sat up, torch in hand, and saw, just for a second, a shape watching from the tree line. Small, still, child-sized. He called out. It vanished. The next morning, his bike started first try. He didn't tell anyone at first. Months later, half drunk in a shed behind the Walkabout Hotel, he shared the story with a visiting journalist. She scribbled it down on a coaster. Years later, that same journalist would write in a memoir that Rowan never again rode alone. It wasn't the shape that scared him, it was the silence that followed. That same year, the town council, in a well-meaning but poorly timed move, proposed a tourism push. Bushwalks. Trail revitalization. A guided tour called Ghosts of the Outback. Locals pushed back hard. Not because of the ghosts, but because some places aren't meant to be reclaimed. There were letters, protests. The project was scrapped quietly, no fanfare. The bush didn't want signs or maps, it wanted distance. That became clear in 2018 when a pair of drone enthusiasts decided to chart the old trail from above. They launched their rig from a ridge near the old car park, following the serpentine path for almost 5 kilometers. The drone fed back live video, red dust, parched trees, ancient rock, until the feed stuttered, froze, cut. They retrieved the drone 2 days later, after searching with a ranger's help. It had crashed against the wall of a narrow gully, battery drained but mostly intact. When they recovered the footage, it was wrong, choppy, glitched. But in one frame, slowed down, zoomed, enhanced, there was a figure, mid-step, a child, again. Same faded dress. But this time a second figure stood further back, taller, watching. The footage was never made public. The men swore they'd deleted it. One of them moved back to Perth. The other stopped flying drones entirely. All they said was that they hadn't imagined it, that the child didn't look lost. She looked like she belonged there. And the taller figure, the one behind her, looked like he didn't want to leave. By the time the second drone incident had filtered through the town's quiet circles, the story of the Gibsons had evolved from tragedy into something older, heavier. No longer just a case of disappearance. It had become part of the land's lore, a seam in the Outback's fabric where reality frayed, where names and faces blurred into legend. And legends, in the bush, are never fully dead, they just wait. In 2020, during the isolation of the pandemic, a retired schoolteacher named Marla Jensen returned to Karratha after years away. Her sister had passed, and she came back to settle affairs. In the quiet of an empty house, surrounded by old photo albums and dust-laced air, she found a letter, folded 3 times, hidden in a book Emily Gibson had once borrowed from her class shelf. Storm Boy by Colin Thiel. The letter was short, a child's handwriting, simple phrases. We saw something. Mom says stay close. It's not a person. That's all it said. No date, no signature. But the name Emily was scribbled on the inside of the back cover, just faint enough to miss, unless you were looking for it. Marla didn't tell the press. She didn't contact police. She quietly donated the book to the local museum under a false name, where it sits now in a drawer not labeled for public view. She only told one friend, a neighbor who recalled Marla saying, "That little girl, she knew something wasn't right, and no one listened." That same winter, a strange weather pattern rolled over the Pilbara. Weeks of dry winds, blood-orange skies, and static that made radios crackle with voices that weren't supposed to be there. CB operators spoke of phantom transmissions, garbled voices repeating the words, "turn back," and "keep quiet" across open channels. A radio hobbyist captured one transmission late at night and posted it to an online archive. It was distorted, nearly unintelligible, but beneath the hiss, a child's voice whispered something. Many heard only static, but a few, those who'd read the old files, walked the dry creek beds, stood near the place where the doll was found, said it sounded like the word home. No one ever traced the transmission's source. And then, there were the drawings. In 2022, a group of secondary students from Perth on a bush art retreat painted landscapes along the outer edges of the trail zone. One girl, quiet, withdrawn, the kind who saw more than she said, produced a canvas that drew sharp attention. It was a wide depiction of the outback, cracked earth under a deep sky. But in the center stood 4 figures, 2 adults, 2 children, rendered as faint silhouettes. Behind them, a shape loomed, not monstrous, just vast, like a shadow carved from rock. Watching, absorbing. When asked, she simply said, "I painted what I saw in the dream." She didn't know the story of the Gibsons, didn't even know the trail had a name. She left the painting with her teacher, who sent it home, rolled in a tube. Weeks later, the teacher passed through Karratha, curious, and showed the piece to a retired ranger. The man went pale. "That's the turnoff," he muttered. "That exact ridge. That's where we stopped looking." He didn't say anything more. No one does, really. Not now. There's a weight to stories like these, a gravity. They pull at something inside us that refuses to stay silent. The part of us that still believes the bush has moods. That it listens. That it remembers. And sometimes, if you're quiet enough, it shows you what it kept. There are those who'll tell you that the Gibson story's just that. A story. That people get lost. Especially in country like that. That heat does strange things to the mind. But that kind of certainty doesn't sit well out here. Not under skies this wide. Not on ground that shifts beneath your feet without warning. Because some things linger. Not because we want them to. Because the land allows them to. In 2023, a private research group, funded anonymously, though rumored to be tied to a university in Melbourne, obtained a permit to conduct a limited excavation near the old turnoff, not far from where the shoe had been found years before. Officially, they were studying erosion patterns, but locals noticed their methods were oddly specific. Ground-penetrating radar, note cards with hand-drawn glyphs, and a drone that hovered in silence for hours, never straying from a small circle of earth scorched long ago. They stayed for 5 days. On the 6th, their camp was empty. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just abandoned. Food left half-cooked. Tents zipped. Not a note, not a call to authorities. They didn't report back to the Shire. Didn't log their exit. They were never named publicly. But one ranger, tasked with documenting the site, took a photograph before the sun dipped too low. In it, half buried in the red dust just inside the ring of the drone's final orbit, is something unmistakable. A child's drawing on a torn piece of paper. 4 stick figures, holding hands. A sun in the corner. The word mum written upside down beneath a crooked tree. The ranger never shared the photo outside his department. But he described it once, years later, to a woman he barely knew, who wrote it down, who read it back to herself over and over until it felt like her own memory. He left the service 6 months after that, moved inland, didn't leave a forwarding address. There's a point in every mystery where speculation begins to fray, where the human mind, desperate for shape and logic, starts to rebel against the idea that some puzzles don't want solving. That maybe the final piece was never meant to be found. That's where the Gibsons live now. In that liminal place, not dead, not alive, not forgotten, but not fully remembered either. They exist in the hesitation before you step off a marked path, in the moment of silence after a twig snaps, and no one else is around, in the dreams you can't quite recall, but wake from with tears in your eyes. Some say they're still out there, not in body, but in trace. Echoes. Residue left behind by something unresolved. One hiker, walking the trail illegally in early 2024, wrote in his blog, before deleting the post a day later, that he'd passed a section where the ground felt different, softer, like walking across fabric stretched too thin. He said he looked down and, just for a moment, saw a shoe print beside his own, Small, light, facing the wrong direction. He didn't go further, didn't take a photo, didn't look back. Just walked out of the bush and didn't return. And still, the trail remains. The trail has thinned, not from erosion or time, but from reluctance. The sort of quiet people carry in their bones, inherited, unspoken. Even the flora seems to have drawn back from it. Spinifex thickets growing wider, gums gnarling toward the sky instead of shading the path. It's as though the land is closing a wound it never wanted opened. And yet, like any scar, it remembers. In early 2025, a young anthropology student named Callum Nagarka, descended from the eastern Guruma, returned to Karratha as part of a cultural mapping initiative. His work was academic, meticulous, restoring knowledge, collecting oral histories before they faded. He wasn't looking for ghosts. But in a taped conversation with his uncle, an elder who'd avoided that area his entire life, something surfaced. "There are stories that walk without feet," the elder said. "On that trail the ground knows names not spoken anymore. They tried to give them back once, but no one was listening." Callum pressed for clarity, but the elder fell silent, closed the notebook, ended the session. Later, he left a single message on Callum's phone, 6 seconds long, wind and static, and then a whisper. "I saw her. She looked at me." Callum never found out who she was. That message, saved under a folder named Karratha Archive, remains unplayed ever since. There's a photograph, tucked into the far corner of the museum archive, one not on display. Black and white. Taken during the early days of the Gibson search. It shows a search team lined along a ridge, flanked by dry bushland and sky. But look closely at the lower right corner. Just behind the last ranger, near the base of a rock, is a shape that doesn't fit. Faint. Smudged. Small. It could be a trick of light. It could be Emily. They don't show the photo anymore. Some reckon the land gives signs to those it chooses. Brief flashes of what's lost. Not to solve the mystery, not to offer comfort, but to remind us that nothing disappears completely, that everything leaves a trace. The case remains open in the books, but in truth, no one investigates it now. There's nothing new to find, no new paths to walk, only the same unanswered questions drifting across scorched soil. 4 people stepped into the outback, and something answered. Something without a face, without need for explanation. In a world filled with surveillance, satellite mapping, AI, and endless data, the Gibson story stands as a defiant truth, that there are still places immune to knowing, places that fold memory and time into silence and swallow it whole. And if you listen closely, the wind still says their names, not in words, not in sound, but in the ache behind your ribs when you stand too long in the wrong place. Maybe the trail isn't a path. Maybe it's a door. And maybe, once you pass through, you don't walk back. The desert doesn't offer closure. Not in the way cities do, not in the way courts or headlines pretend it can. It doesn't file endings into neat boxes. It swallows them, grinds them down into dust, mixes them into the shifting heat and low keening of the wind. It waits, not for answers, but for forgetting. But some stories are too deeply rooted for that. Some names too heavy to be unremembered. What happened to David, Sarah, Emily, and Tom Gibson in August of 1987 isn't carved into stone. It isn't held in any one theory. It's smeared across the landscape like heat mirage, visible for a moment, then gone. Theories still churn in the margins of online forums, tucked between blurry satellite screenshots and threads dissecting pixelated photos that might be tree shadows or might be figures. But none of them, not dehydration, nor abduction, nor sacred site trespass, nor the occasional flare of the paranormal, explain what truly lingers about this case, because it's not about what happened. It's about what the land refuses to give back. And maybe that's the point. That this trail, this red artery of stone and silence cutting into the belly of Western Australia, isn't a scene of a crime or an accident. It's a question with no punctuation. A door that opened once and hasn't shut since. In recent months, a new rumor has begun to circulate, not through news or officials, but in the low murmur of campfire talk, in shared glances across the pub after the 3rd pint. A man, not from Karratha, but from somewhere out past Newman, Stopped in town on his way north. Dirty ute, sunburned neck, eyes like river stones. He spoke little. Stayed one night at the caravan park, then vanished again. But before he left, he handed a folded cloth to the night manager. Said simply, "This was never mine," then walked into the dark. Inside the cloth, a small rusted camping knife, handle worn, blade dull with age. On its side, the initials DG, faint beneath corrosion. David Gibson. The knife was later examined. No prints, no blood. But the steel matched a 1980s issue only sold in 3 stores across WA. One of them, back in the day, right here in Karratha. How it surfaced, who had it, why it was returned, no one knows. But it reignited something. Not hope. No one in town truly believes the Gibsons will walk out of the bush. Not after this long. But the knife whispered the same word every clue has whispered since 1987. Remember. Some say they still walk the trail. Not as phantoms, but as memory made flesh, caught in a loop stitched into the land's fabric. A story retelling itself every dusk. Hikers report hearing the laughter of children carried on the wind, always distant, always receding. A park warden, anonymous in his report, claimed to hear a woman's voice repeating the words, "We're here," soft and steady, from the gully near the second ridge. He left the service within the month. And what of the trail itself? It's quieter now than it's ever been. The signage is gone, the path overgrown. Satellite images show a landscape returned to silence, but that doesn't mean it's empty. Some places don't vanish when you stop looking. They wait. They learn the shape of your breath, the rhythm of your thoughts. They adapt. The land around Karratha has always been marked, not just by ancient fault lines and mineral veins, but by stories layered one atop the other like sediment. Stories of spirits that shimmer in heat haze, of rocks that whisper names, of footsteps that stop mid-stride. The Gibson family isn't the first to vanish, likely not the last. But their absence carved something permanent, a silence that echoes louder than any scream. It's said that if you walk far enough, just before the air thins and the red dust begins to taste like iron on your tongue, you'll reach a place where time feels wrong, where your shadow stretches in directions the sun doesn't allow, where you know, without knowing how, that you've stepped onto a piece of land that remembers more than you do. And there, if the wind's just right, if the earth is still enough, and if you're very, very quiet, you might hear the faint crunch of small feet in gravel behind you, might feel the presence of something watching, not with menace, but with mournful recognition. As if you are not the first to pass that way, as if you are being measured, considered, and ultimately, allowed to leave, for now. Because some confessions are not meant to be heard, some are meant to be felt. And Karratha's Crimson Trail, scorched, silent, and unsolved, remains one of the Outback's greatest. Not for what it reveals, but for what it refuses to. The Gibsons walked into the heart of a country older than language, deeper than bone. And the Outback, in its quiet, merciless way, chose not to return them. Not fully. The bush speaks. Are you listening?